Blood freezing at 24,000 feet doesn't just numb the body, it crystallizes the soul. High above the flak, scarred patchwork of Tunisia, a roaring beast of aluminum and steel was dying. 10 men were trapped inside a metal tube that had just been torn wide open by a shrieking German fighter, leaving the bomber's tail dangling by a mere fraction of its frame. Parachutes were useless in the spinning vortex of the disintegrating fuselage. Giving the bailout order meant certain death for the men trapped in the severed rear section. One pilot had to make an impossible choice: abandon his doomed ship to the merciless grip of gravity, or wrestle a mathematically dead airplane across 300 miles of hostile sky to bring his brothers home. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with the harsh, grating bleat of a klaxon echoing across the dusty expanse of Biskra airfield in Algeria. It was the 1st of February 1943. The bitter North African night still clung to the desert, wrapping the parked B-17 flying fortresses in a layer of freezing dew that felt like sandpaper against bare skin. First Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg stood beneath the massive port wing of his ship, the All-American. He was a broad-shouldered man, a former varsity football player for Duke University, whose calm demeanor anchored the 10 men who depended on him. He traced a gloved hand along the cold aluminum skin of the fuselage. The bomber was a magnificent, terrifying piece of machinery. 4 Wright R. 1,820 Cyclone engines waited silently, harboring the explosive power to lift 65,000 pounds of metal, high-explosive bombs, and human lives into the thin, unforgiving air. "She feels heavy today, Ken," muttered Godfrey Engel, the co-pilot, stepping out from the shadow of the bomb bay. Engel was meticulous, a man who checked his instruments 3 times before trusting them once. "She'll fly, Godfrey," Bragg replied, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the frigid morning wind. "She always does. Just make sure the superchargers are primed. The brass wants us at 24,000 feet today." Inside the briefing hut, the air had been thick with the smell of stale coffee, unfiltered Lucky Strikes, and the unwashed tension of young men facing their own mortality. The target was the heavily fortified seaport of Tunis. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was desperately trying to keep his supply lines open, and the Luftwaffe had concentrated their fiercest fighter squadrons, the seasoned veterans of Jagdgeschwader, 53 along the coast, to protect the docks. The intelligence officer had pointed to the map with a wooden dowel, tapping the red circles denoting anti-aircraft batteries with a sickeningly casual rhythm. Now, as the crew assembled by the boarding hatch, the reality of the map translated into the visceral weight of their gear. Each man wore a fleece-lined leather flight suit, heavy boots, and a parachute harness that dug uncomfortably into their shoulders. Navigator Harry Nussel, a sharp-eyed mathematician who could plot a course by the stars through a keyhole, checked his charts one last time. Beside him, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge adjusted the straps on his oxygen mask. Burbridge held the keys to the mission's success. Once they reached the initial point of the bomb run, the entire aircraft would be under his control through the Norden bomb site. "Everyone loaded?" Bragg asked, looking down the line. Joe Gallagher, the flight engineer and top turret gunner, gave a thumbs up. Behind him were the men who would live in the freezing, unpressurized rear of the ship. Radio operator Elton Conda, waist gunners Michael Zook and Paul Coulson, and finally Sal Taormina. Sal was the tail gunner. He was the smallest man in the crew, a requirement for the cramped, isolated glass bubble at the very rear of the flying fortress. His job was the loneliest and arguably the most dangerous. "See you on the other side, Sal," Zook said, clapping the tail gunner on the shoulder. "Just keep the Messerschmitts off my back, Mike," Taormina replied with a tight grin, though his eyes betrayed the nervous energy humming through his veins. Bragg and Engel climbed through the lower hatch, pulling themselves up into the cockpit. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and cold metal was intoxicating, a familiar perfume that signaled the point of no return. Bragg settled into the left seat, his hands naturally finding the massive control yoke. "Switches on," Bragg commanded, initiating the startup sequence. "Switches on," Engel echoed. One by one, the massive radial engines coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. Thick plumes of blue-gray smoke billowed across the tarmac as the propellers blurred into silver discs. The noise was deafening, a physical force that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the men's teeth. The All-American trembled, eager to slip the surly bonds of the desert. Bragg advanced the throttles. The heavy bomber lumbered forward, joining the procession of olive-drab aircraft taxiing toward the runway. Dust kicked up by the lead planes turned the dawn into a hazy, chaotic blur. "Tower to All-American, you are cleared for takeoff," the radio crackled in Bragg's headset. "Roger, Tower. All-American, rolling." Bragg pushed the 4 throttle levers all the way forward. The roar escalated into a sustained, deafening scream. The bomber picked up speed, the tires thumping against the uneven dirt runway. 60 miles an hour, 80, 100. The controls, previously sluggish, grew taut and responsive in Bragg's hands. He eased the yoke back. The rumbling ceased. They were airborne, climbing heavily into the bruised purple sky, leaving the safety of the earth far behind. Crossing the Atlas Mountains was a grueling test of endurance. As the bomber formation climbed higher, the temperature plummeted with terrifying speed. At 20,000 feet, the thermometer outside Bragg's window read 40 degrees below zero. Inside the unheated fuselage, frost instantly formed on the metal bulkheads. The crew breathed through rubber masks, inhaling the metallic-tasting supplemental oxygen that kept them from blacking out in the thin atmosphere. Radio operator Elton Conda shivered violently, his fingers stiff despite the thick, electrically heated gloves. He continuously monitored the frequency, listening for any sign of German radar locking onto their formation. Below them, the rugged, barren peaks of the mountains gave way to the shimmering blue expanse of the Mediterranean and the coastal plains of Tunisia. "Navigator to pilot." Newsel's voice crackled over the intercom, distorted by the static and the rubber of his mask. "Initial point in 5 minutes. Course 090. "Copy, Harry," Bragg replied. He glanced out the side window. The formation of B-17S was flying in a tight staggered box, a defensive tactic designed to create an overlapping dome of heavy machine gun fire. From the outside, they looked majestic and invincible. Inside, every man knew they were fragile targets moving at 200 miles an hour. "Bombardier taking control," Burbridge announced. Bragg relinquished his grip on the yoke slightly, letting the autopilot slave to the Norden bombsight guide the All-American. Then, the sky turned black. "Flak! 12 o'clock!" Engel shouted. Puffs of greasy black smoke erupted directly in their flight path. It wasn't the smoke that was dangerous. It was the razor-sharp shrapnel, hidden within those dark clouds, hurled outward at supersonic speeds by the exploding 88mm anti-aircraft shells. The sound of flak was unmistakable, a concussive, hollow whump that physically rocked the massive bomber. Clack, clack, clack. Pieces of shrapnel peppered the underside of the wings like demonic hail. "Hold her steady," Burbridge commanded, his eyes glued to the optics of his bomb sight. The crosshairs drifted over the docks of Tunis, aligning with the concrete submarine pens and supply warehouses. "Steady, steady." Bragg's hands hovered over the controls, his knuckles white. The urge to take evasive action was overwhelming, a primal instinct screaming at him to dodge the explosions. But doctrine dictated they fly straight and level, offering themselves as sitting ducks for the anti-aircraft gunners to ensure the bombs hit their mark. Whump! A shell detonated terrifyingly close to the right wing, flipping the 30-ton bomber into a sickening 30-degree bank. Bragg and Engel fought the yokes together, muscling the All-American back onto an even keel. "Bombs away!" Burbridge yelled. The aircraft suddenly lunged upward, instantly relieved of 4,000 pounds of high explosives. Bragg immediately grabbed the yoke, kicking the rudder pedals to begin a steep evasive turn to the left, breaking away from the target area. Below them, a series of violent flashes illuminated the docks, followed by towering columns of pulverized concrete and smoke. Good hits, Gallagher shouted from the top turret. But the relief was fleeting. The flak abruptly stopped. For a veteran bomber crew, The cessation of anti-aircraft fire wasn't a blessing. It was the ultimate harbinger of doom. The ground gunners only stopped firing when their own fighters were entering the kill zone. "Bandits! Bandits at 6 o'clock high!" screamed Sal Taormina from the tail. "A whole swarm of them!" Bragg twisted in his seat. Small gray dots were diving out of the blinding sun, growing larger with terrifying speed. They were Messerschmitt Bf 109s, the lethal apex predators of the Luftwaffe. The intercom exploded into a chaotic symphony of callouts, 2 coming in at 3 o'clock. "Waist gunners, track 'em. I got one at 9 o'clock low." The interior of the All-American filled with the deafening, rhythmic hammering of the Browning 50 caliber machine guns. Empty brass casings rained down on the aluminum floorboards like coins from a broken slot machine, filling the air with the acrid stench of cordite. Gallagher's twin guns in the top turret tracked a yellow-nosed Bf 109 as it slashed through the formation. The German pilot opened fire, the leading edges of his wings sparkling with strobe-like flashes. A line of tracer rounds glowing a demonic neon green whipped past Bragg's windshield, missing the cockpit glass by inches. Zook and Coulson fired simultaneously from the waist windows, the recoil shaking the entire midsection of the plane. They were fighting a desperate, three-dimensional battle. The German fighters hunted in pairs, utilizing high-speed slashing attacks designed to overwhelm the gunners. They would dive, fire a 2-second burst of 20mm cannon shells, and roll away before the American turrets could track them. In the tail, Sal Taormina was living in a nightmare of spinning horizons and deafening noise. He knelt in his cramped compartment, his hands gripping the spade grips of his twin, 50S. A Bf 109 filled his retinas, its propeller spinner growing impossibly huge. Sal squeezed the triggers. His tracers walked perfectly into the engine block of the attacking fighter. The Messerschmitt suddenly belched black smoke, snap-rolled violently, and plummeted toward the earth. "Got him! I got one!" Sal yelled, his voice cracking. But the swarm was relentless. The sky was a chaotic tapestry of white contrails, green tracers, and plunging aircraft. A B-17 to their left took a direct cannon hit to its number 3 engine. The wing erupted in a geyser of flame, and within seconds, the stricken bomber began a death spiral. 10 men trapped inside the burning coffin. Bragg forced himself not to look, his eyes darting across his own engine gauges. "They're reforming," Engel warned, pointing forward. 12 o'clock, head-on pass. Bragg squinted through the reinforced glass. 2 Bf 109s were leveling out 3 miles ahead, turning directly toward the nose of the All-American. The closing speed of a head-on attack was over 500 miles an hour. It was a terrifying game of aerial chicken, designed to break the nerve of the bomber pilots. "Burbridge, Nusel, nose guns, let 'em have it," Bragg roared. The 2 fighters came on, growing from specks to distinct, lethal silhouettes. In the lead, Messerschmitt sat a German pilot who had already claimed a dozen Allied planes. His engine was howling, his thumb hovering over the cannon trigger. The gap closed. 2 miles, 1 mile. The noses of the German fighters lit up. Golf ball-sized cannon shells tore through the air. One shell smashed through the All-American's right-wing root, blowing a jagged hole through the aluminum but miraculously missing the fuel tanks. Burbridge and Nusel fired back, their single guns tracing desperate lines of lead toward the attackers. At 500 yards, the second German fighter broke off, diving sharply under the bomber formation. But the lead fighter didn't flinch. He kept coming. 300 yards. 200. Pull up, you crazy bastard," Engel screamed, instinctively raising his hands to shield his face. The German pilot had frozen. Whether he was dead, severely wounded by the nose gunner's fire, or his controls had been shot away, no one would ever know. The Bf 109 didn't break away. It came hurtling over the cockpit of the All-American, missing the windshield by mere feet. Bragg ducked as a blur of gray metal and a massive black cross eclipsed the sun. For a fraction of a second, Bragg thought they had survived the impossible pass. Then came the impact. It didn't sound like a crash. It sounded like the world being ripped in half. The noise was a catastrophic shrieking tear of heavy metal, followed instantly by an explosive decompression that sucked the breath from Bragg's lungs. The All-American didn't just shake. She convulsed violently as if struck by the fist of an angry god. The heavy bomber was instantly thrown into a brutal, vertical climb. The G-forces slammed Bragg and Engel back into their armored seats. Books, navigation charts, and empty bullet casings flew toward the rear of the cockpit in a deadly blizzard of debris. Push down! Push down! Bragg roared over the deafening rush of wind howling through the aircraft. He threw his entire body weight forward onto the yoke. His boots braced desperately against the rudder pedals. Engel mirrored his movements, his face contorted in a mask of sheer physical exertion. The control columns were impossibly stiff, resisting their combined strength like they were set in concrete. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose of the flying fortress began to drop, leveling out at 22,000 feet. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the roar of the guns. The engines were still running, their steady thrum a stark contrast to the catastrophic violence that had just occurred. But the control yokes felt wrong, spongy, uncoordinated, disconnected. "Report!" Bragg yelled into his microphone. "Crew check. Sound off. God damn it, sound off." Static hissed back at him. The intercom was completely dead. Bragg looked at Engel. The co-pilot's face was ashen, his eyes wide behind his goggles. "What the hell hit us, Ken?" "Gallagher." Bragg unbuckled his safety harness and leaned backward toward the top turret. "Joe, get back there and see what happened." Gallagher dropped down from his turret, his face pale. He disconnected his oxygen hose, grabbed a portable walk-around bottle, and scrambled through the narrow passageway toward the bomb bay. In the nose compartment, Nussel and Burbridge had been thrown violently against the bulkheads. Nussel, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, crawled toward the crawlway leading back to the cockpit. The wind rushing through the plane was unnatural, freezing and deafening. Gallagher pushed open the door leading to the radio room and stopped dead in his tracks. The rear of the aircraft was gone. Or rather, it was no longer an aircraft. It was an open-air nightmare. Where the solid, cylindrical fuselage should have been, there was nothing but a massive, gaping hole of jagged, torn aluminum. The bright blue sky of North Africa shone through a wound that stretched from the waist gunner's windows all the way down to the floorboards. The German fighter had completely misjudged its pass. Its right wing had acted like a monstrous meat cleaver, slicing clean through the B-17's fuselage just aft of the radio room. The massive tail section containing the vertical stabilizer, the horizontal elevators, and the tail gunner's compartment was still there, but it was defying the laws of physics. It was hanging on by a mere 2 stringers, thin strips of structural aluminum, no thicker than a man's wrist, and a narrow shred of the lower floor panel. The entire rear third of the bomber was swaying side to side in the windstream like a severed limb dangling by a tendon. "Jesus Christ," Gallagher whispered, the words lost in the hurricane roaring through the cabin. He looked toward the waist section. Zook and Coulson were huddled near the edge of the chasm, their safety harnesses clipped to the bulkheads, staring in absolute horror at the void. Through the massive gap, Gallagher could see the control cables for the rudder and elevators. Miraculously, a few of them had not snapped, though they were stretched taut over the jagged edges of torn metal. Gallagher scrambled back to the cockpit, his chest heaving. He grabbed Bragg by the shoulder and screamed over the roar of the engines. "The tail! The whole damn tail is gone, Ken. It's cut in half. It's just hanging on by a thread." Bragg's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked out his side window. By craning his neck, he could see the shadow of his own aircraft on the cloud layer below. The shadow was broken, bent at a terrifying angle. "Are the waist gunners alive?" Bragg shouted back. "Yes, but the tail." "Ken, Sal is still back there. Sal is in the tail." Bragg felt a cold dread wash over him that had nothing to do with the sub-zero air. Sal Taormina. The smallest man on the crew was trapped in a severed section of the airplane, that could snap off and plummet 20,000 feet to the earth at any second. "We have to bail out," Engel said, his voice tight with panic. He reached for the alarm bell switch. "Ken, she's mathematically dead. If that tail goes, our center of gravity violently shifts. We'll tumble end over end. We won't be able to get out." Engel was right. The physics of the situation were absolute. The All-American was an aerodynamic impossibility. The only thing keeping the tail attached was the forward momentum of the aircraft, pressing the severed sections together against the terrifying drag of the wind. If Bragg changed speed, turned too sharply, or hit a pocket of turbulence, the stringers would snap. Bragg looked down at the bailout bell. One flip of the switch, and the men in the front could drop through the hatches, pop their chutes, and take their chances in the desert below as prisoners of war. But what about Sal? If Bragg sounded the alarm, the sudden movement of men bailing out, the shift in weight, would almost certainly cause the tail to detach. Even if it didn't, Sal was trapped. The doorway leading from the tail gunner's compartment to the rest of the plane was blocked by crushed metal and the sheer, open void of the sky. Sal couldn't reach the main body of the aircraft to jump, and a tail gunner bailing out of a spinning detached empennage was a guaranteed death sentence. Bragg looked at Engel, his jaw set like granite. He slammed his hand over Engel's, pushing it away from the bailout switch. "Nobody jumps," Bragg ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Ken, we're going to die," Engel protested. "I said nobody jumps," Bragg roared, his eyes locking onto his co-pilots. "We leave now. We signed Sal's death warrant. We don't leave our own behind. I'm flying this broken son of a bitch back to base." He turned back to the instruments. The compass was spinning lazily. The airspeed indicator was twitching. "Gallagher!" Bragg shouted. "Get back there! Tell Zook and Coulson to rig parachute harnesses together. Tie them across the gap. Try to anchor that tail. And someone get Sal on the emergency line. Tell him to stay absolutely still." Bragg gripped the yoke, his knuckles white, feeling the sluggish, terrifyingly fragile response of the wounded giant. They were 300 miles from Biskra. 300 miles over enemy territory, in a plane that was bleeding to death, held together by nothing but friction, a few strips of metal, and the absolute refusal of its pilot to let it fall. The fight for survival had just begun. Desperation in the frozen stratosphere possesses a strange, terrifying clarity. Aft of the radio room, the interior of the All-American had been transformed into a screaming wind tunnel. The ambient temperature of -40 degrees Fahrenheit violently clawed at the exposed skin of the crew, while the roar of the slipstream through the severed fuselage drowned out all human sound. Joe Gallagher, his breath frosting inside his oxygen mask, crept toward the ragged edge of the chasm. The floorboards ended in a jagged metallic cliff. Beyond it lay a terrifying gap of empty air, framing the dizzying, patchwork earth 20,000 feet below. Across that 3-foot void, the entire tail section swayed with the sickening rhythm of a pendulum. The two narrow aluminum stringers, and the shattered remnant of the lower catwalk, were all that connected the rear of the bomber to the front. Michael Zook and Paul Coulson, the waist gunners, were pressed against the forward bulkhead, their eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the fear of combat. They were looking at an impossible suspension of physics. Gallagher grabbed Zook by the thick collar of his fleece jacket and pulled him close, pressing his flight helmet against Zook's ear to be heard over the deafening hurricane. "Parachutes!" Gallagher screamed, his voice tearing at his throat. "Take off the harnesses! We have to tie her together." Comprehension dawned in Zook's eyes. It was a madman's plan, born of absolute necessity. If the metal was failing, they would use the heavy nylon webbing of their parachute harnesses to create a makeshift bridge. It was the ultimate gamble, surrendering their only means of personal salvation to save the ship and the man trapped in the back. Without hesitation, Zook unbuckled his chest straps. Coulson followed suit, stripping off the heavy canvas and nylon rig that was supposed to be his ticket home. Gallagher did the same. They unspooled the thick suspension lines and heavy webbing, their thick gloves making the intricate work maddeningly clumsy. "I need an anchor point," Gallagher yelled, waving the heavy steel buckle of his harness. Coulson pointed to the sturdy mounts of the waist guns. They wrapped the nylon webs around the heavy steel brackets of the Browning. 50 calibers on the forward side of the tear. Now came the nightmare. Someone had to reach across the void to thread the lines through the exposed structural ribs of the detached tail section. Zook volunteered. He hooked a safety lanyard to a solid floor ring, laid flat on his stomach, and shimmied toward the precipice. The slipstream battered him relentlessly, threatening to suck him out into the blue. He reached across the freezing gap. His fingertips brushed the icy aluminum of the swaying tail. He missed. The bomber hit a pocket of turbulence. The tail section bucked violently, dropping 6 inches. A sickening creak of stressed metal echoed even above the wind. Up in the cockpit, Kendrick Bragg and Godfrey Engel felt the drop. The control yoke violently jerked forward, nearly snapping Bragg's wrists. The two men groaned, their muscles burning as they heaved backward with everything they had. They were flying the massive aircraft entirely by raw physical exertion. The control cables that ran through the ceiling of the bomber to the elevators and rudder were exposed in the gap. Some were severed, others were hopelessly frayed, catching on the jagged edges of torn aluminum. Every time Bragg moved the yoke, he risked snapping the remaining strands. "She's getting heavier, Ken," Engel grunted, sweat stinging his eyes despite the freezing temperature of the cockpit. "The drag is pulling the nose down. If we lose airspeed, she stalls. If she stalls, the tail snaps over the top." "Keep the power up," Bragg commanded, his gaze locked on the artificial horizon. "I'm not letting her drop. Just keep pulling, Godfrey. Don't stop pulling." Back at the chasm, Zook lunged again. This time, his heavy glove caught the edge of an exposed rib in the tail section. He dragged the heavy nylon harness through the metal lattice, looped it back, and tossed the heavy buckle across the void to Coulson. They pulled it taut, wrapping it around the gun mount and locking it down. They repeated the process with a second harness, then a third, creating a desperate, crisscrossing spiderweb of parachute webbing over the abyss. It wasn't a structural fix, but it provided a terrifyingly fragile tension that arrested the worst of the tail's violent swaying. Yet, the most agonizing drama was unfolding in the very rear of the aircraft. Inside the isolated glass and metal bubble of the tail gunner's position, Sal Taormina was trapped in a silent, freezing purgatory. When the German fighter had slammed through the fuselage, the violent whiplash had thrown Sal brutally against his armor plating, knocking the wind out of him. His intercom cord had been severed instantly. His oxygen hose was stretched to its absolute limit, connected to a localized bottle that was rapidly depleting. Sal slowly pushed himself up, his head swimming. He looked out his side windows. The sky was empty of fighters for the moment, but the horizon was tilting at odd, sickening angles. He turned around, expecting to see the familiar long tunnel of the fuselage leading up to the waist gunners. Instead, he saw the sky. The blood drained from Sal's face. The door that led from his compartment into the tailwheel housing was crushed shut, bent inward by the sheer torsional force of the collision. Beyond the crushed metal, he could see daylight where the solid belly of the B-17 should have been. He was completely cut off, riding in a severed pod that was clinging to the main aircraft by a prayer and a few strips of torn metal. Panic, cold and sharp, seized his chest. He banged on the crushed door. Nothing. He yelled into his dead microphone. Silence. He was a passenger in a dying machine, unable to bail out, unable to reach his crewmates, forced to sit in the cramped glass bubble and wait for the inevitable plunge into the abyss. Then, he saw movement across the gap. Through the jagged tear, he caught a glimpse of Zook's face, framed by the makeshift spiderweb of parachute harnesses. Zook raised a hand, making a slow, deliberate, pressing motion downward. "Stay still." Sal understood. Any sudden movement, any shift in his weight, could throw off the impossibly delicate center of gravity and snap the remaining stringers. The smallest man on the crew nodded slowly. He sat back down in his tiny canvas seat, gripping his armrests, and became a statue. He would ride the tail down to the earth, or he would ride it home. There was no middle ground. Survival in aerial warfare is a mathematics of speed and altitude. The All-American was rapidly losing both. The colossal aerodynamic drag created by the severed fuselage acted like an invisible parachute. To keep the bomber from stalling, Bragg had to keep the engines running at maximum continuous power, burning through precious high-octane fuel at an alarming rate. Even with the throttles pushed forward, the crippled B-17 could only muster a pathetic 140 miles per hour. Slowly but inevitably, they fell out of the protective staggered box of their bombardment group. The rest of the B-17s, adhering strictly to doctrine, had to maintain their airspeed to survive the long trek back over hostile territory. Bragg watched through his side window as the Silver Armada pulled ahead, their contrails painting pristine white lines across the blue sky. The All-American was left behind, a bleeding straggler limping through the thin, freezing air. "We're alone, Ken," Engel said, his voice stripped of its earlier panic, replaced by a grim, hollow resignation. "We're out of the umbrella." "Harry," Bragg called over the intercom to the navigator. "Give me a heading, shortest route to the coast." "Course 305, Captain," Nessel replied from the nose, his voice tight. "But we're over the worst of it now. German fighter bases at Medjez el Bab are right below us." As if summoned by the navigator's words, the intercom crackled to life with Elton Conda's voice from the radio room. "Fighters, I see dots. 6 o'clock low, climbing fast." The wolves had caught the scent of blood. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s, the sleek, heavily armed butchers of the Luftwaffe, were angling upward from the desert floor. They had spotted the lone straggler, a massive, sluggish target separated from the herd. It was an interceptor's dream. In the waist, Zook and Coulson racked the bolts of their heavy machine guns, feeding the thick belts of .50 caliber ammunition into the receivers. They stood at the edge of the gaping chasm, the freezing wind threatening to rip the guns from their hands. "Don't fire unless you have a guaranteed shot," Gallagher yelled, clinging to the bulkhead behind them. "If you shake the plane too hard, the tail goes." It was a devastating tactical constraint. The primary defense of a B-17 was laying down a massive, sustained curtain of fire. Now, the violent recoil of the heavy weapons could be the very thing that destroyed them. The structural integrity of the aircraft was so compromised that the vibration of the waist guns firing simultaneously might shatter the fragile parachute webbing holding the ship together. In the tail, Sal Taormina watched the 2 Focke-Wulfs growing larger in his sights. The fighters split up, one banking right, the other coming dead astern, preparing to pour cannon fire straight up the bomber's tailpipe. Sal gripped the spade handles of his twin, 50S. His thumbs hovered over the firing buttons. He had the trailing fighter dead to rights. A 2-second burst would shred the FW-190's engine cowl. But a horrifying realization washed over him. The tailgun was the heaviest armament on the ship, and it was mounted directly into the severed tail section. The combined recoil of the twin heavy machine guns firing was over 500 pounds of force pushing backward. If Sal pulled the trigger, the explosive recoil would act like a massive hammer blow, driving the severed tail backward and instantly snapping the 2 remaining stringers. To defend himself was to kill himself and his entire crew. Sal swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He took his thumbs off the triggers. He sat in his glass bubble, a completely defenseless target, staring down the glowing gun barrels of the approaching German fighter. He braced for the impact of the 20mm cannon shells that would obliterate him and the tail section in a shower of hot shrapnel. The FW-190 closed to 500 yards, 400, 300. Sal could clearly see the yellow spinner on the propeller, the black soot staining the exhaust ports, the glint of the sun on the pilot's goggles. But the gunfire never came. Instead of opening fire, the German pilot abruptly pulled his nose up, bleeding off speed, and slid his fighter alongside the All-American. He was so close that Sal could see the heavy stitching on the pilot's leather flight jacket. The German pilot looked across the 50 yards of empty air at the crippled bomber. His head swiveled, taking in the catastrophic damage. He saw the gaping, ragged hole where the fuselage should have been. He saw the improvised web of parachute webbing fluttering violently in the slipstream. He saw the exposed control cables, and he saw Sal, sitting motionless in the severed tail, staring back at him. For 10 agonizing seconds, the two enemies flew in tandem, suspended in a surreal, silent tableau over the North African desert. The German pilot slowly pushed his goggles up onto his forehead. He stared at the All-American, with an expression of sheer, unadulterated disbelief. Aerodynamically, the B-17 beside him did not exist. It was a ghost ship, a collection of scrap metal that had no business being in the sky. There was no honor in shooting down a dead plane, and perhaps the German pilot realized that pulling the trigger would only be an act of desecrating a miracle. The Luftwaffe pilot looked back at Sal. He didn't salute, and he didn't smile. He simply shook his head slowly, a universal gesture of astonishment. He tapped his wingman on the radio, dipped his wing, and the two Focke-Wulfs peeled away, diving back toward the safety of the earth, leaving the doomed flying fortress to its inevitable fate. "They're gone," Sal whispered into the empty glass bubble, his hands trembling violently as the adrenaline receded. In the cockpit, Bragg watched the Fu-190S disappear into the haze. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. But the relief was fleeting. A red warning light illuminated on the instrument panel, glaring like an angry eye. "Fuel pressure dropping on engine number 3, Engel reported, his voice tight. "The line must be damaged. She's starved for gas, Ken." The inboard starboard engine sputtered, coughed a thick cloud of black smoke, and died. The propeller windmilled uselessly, creating massive drag on the right side of the aircraft. The All-American yawed violently, the severed tail groaning as the aerodynamic forces twisted the fuselage. "Feather number 3, Bragg shouted, his boots slamming against the left rudder pedal to counteract the sudden pull. "And pump the remaining fuel to the good engines." They were down to 3 engines, losing altitude, bleeding fuel, and barely held together by parachute straps. The Mediterranean Sea lay ahead, a vast, cold expanse of blue that promised nothing but a watery grave for a plane that couldn't possibly ditch without snapping in two. Biskra Airfield was still 150 miles away. The real fight hadn't even begun. Flying a B-17 on 3 engines was standard procedure for a seasoned pilot. Flying a B-17 on 3 engines with a severed tail, massive drag, and a shifting center of gravity was an exercise in sustained waking terror. For the next 2 hours, the cockpit of the All-American became a torture chamber of pure physical endurance. Kendrick Bragg and Godfrey Engel locked their arms straight out, their boots braced furiously against the rudder pedals, fighting the relentless aerodynamic pull that wanted to send the nose diving into the Saharan sands. Sweat soaked through their heavy fleece flight suits, pooling in their boots despite the frigid air whipping through the shattered fuselage. "Harry, talk to me," Bragg rasped into his throat mic, his voice hoarse from the dry oxygen. "Where are we?" Harry Nussel, huddled in the drafty nose cone, wiped a smear of frozen blood from his goggles. "We're approaching the Atlas Range, Ken, but we have a problem, a massive one. Add it to the list." Engel muttered, his knuckles white on the yoke. "We're currently at 10,000 feet and dropping," Nussel reported, his voice tight. "The lowest pass through this section of the mountains is Kasserine, and that sits at just over 4,000 feet. With our sink rate and the downdrafts coming off the peaks, we might not clear the ridges." Bragg swallowed hard. The brutal math of their situation was closing in. To clear the mountains, he needed to increase power and pitch the nose up to climb. But pitching up would decrease their already pitiful airspeed, risking a deadly stall. If the plane stalled, the nose would whip down, the tail would snap over the top like a broken hinge, and they would instantly disintegrate. "We can't climb, Harry," Bragg said, his voice flat. "Find me a valley, a canyon, anything. We're going to have to thread the needle." In the waist of the bomber, the makeshift parachute web was reaching its absolute breaking point. The heavy nylon straps, designed to hold the weight of a single falling man, were now bearing the fluctuating, multi-ton torsion of a severed empennage. Michael Zook and Paul Coulson watched in horror as the thick webbing began to fray against the jagged aluminum edges of the blast hole. Snap. The sound was as loud as a rifle shot. One of the primary tension lines anchoring the left side of the tail gave way. The severed rear section immediately lurched violently to the right, sagging a terrifying 6 inches downward. "Ken, we lost a line!" Joe Gallagher screamed from the radio room doorway. The tail is twisting. In the isolated glass bubble at the very back, Sal Taormina was thrown hard against the side of his compartment. He looked down through his boots and saw the earth spinning wildly beneath him. The thin aluminum stringers holding his tomb to the rest of the plane began to groan a high-pitched, metallic shriek that vibrated into his very bones. He closed his eyes, clutching his rosary beads with frozen, trembling fingers. "Hold her steady, Ken," Engel yelled, fighting the sudden, vicious yaw. "I've got it! I've got it!" Bragg roared, his shoulder muscles screaming as he jammed his left leg into the rudder pedal to counteract the twist. "Gallagher! Anchor it again! Use whatever you have left. Use your belts. Use the gunslings. Just tie the damn thing down." Beneath them, the flat desert gave way to the jagged, merciless teeth of the Atlas Mountains. Towering walls of red rock and loose shale rose up on either side of the crippled bomber. Bragg had elected to fly directly into a winding gorge, navigating the massive, dying flying fortress like a fighter plane. The turbulence rolling off the sun-baked rocks was brutal. Invisible fists of air battered the All-American. Every updraft threatened to snap the remaining nylon straps. Every downdraft pushed them closer to the canyon floor. Bragg and Engel fought the yokes in a frenzied, synchronized dance, banking the heavy bomber mere hundreds of feet away from the sheer cliff faces. "Left turn coming up," Nussel called out from the nose, acting as their eyes. "Hard left, Ken, or we eat a wall." Bragg eased the yoke to the left, terrified of putting too much stress on the dangling tail. The B-17 banked sluggishly. The right wingtip seemed to brush the jagged rocks of the canyon wall. For a terrifying 10 seconds, the shadow of the mountain engulfed them, the engines echoing with a deafening metallic roar against the stone. Then, the gorge opened up. The towering peaks fell away, revealing the flat, sun-drenched plains of Algeria. A collective, shuddering gasp echoed through the intercom. They had cleared the mountains, but as the adrenaline of the canyon run faded, the brutal reality of their fuel gauges took center stage. "Engines 1 and 2 are practically running on fumes," Engel reported, tapping the glass dials. "We have maybe 20 minutes of flight time left. Biskra is still 30 miles out." "Start looking for a soft patch of sand, Godfrey," Bragg said grimly. "We might have to belly her in." Biskra Airfield appeared on the horizon, not as a savior, but as a dusty, shimmering mirage. The olive-drab tents and graded dirt runways were a welcome sight, but they brought the ultimate, terrifying dilemma of the flight. "Tower, this is All-American," Elton Conda transmitted, his hand shaking on the radio dial. "Mayday, mayday. We are coming in on 3 engines. Severe structural damage. We need immediate emergency crews on the tarmac." "Roger, All-American," the tower crackled back, the controller's voice laced with shock. "We have you on visual. Good God. You're cleared for immediate straight-in approach. The runway is yours." Bragg stared at the dirt strip approaching in his windshield. "All right, Godfrey. Moment of truth. Do we drop the gear?" It was a devil's bargain. Lowering the massive main landing gear would create a tremendous amount of aerodynamic drag beneath the aircraft. That sudden change in airflow could easily create enough turbulence to rip the dangling tail section clean off. But if they left the gear up and attempted a belly landing, the violent friction of sliding across the dirt would undoubtedly crush the severed tail, instantly killing Sal Taormina inside. They had to try and land on the wheels. They had to land a broken, heavy bomber, like a delicate feather. "Drop the gear," Bragg ordered. "But do it slow, 1 notch at a time." Engel reached for the heavy lever. He moved it an inch. The hydraulic pumps whined. Beneath the wings, the massive rubber tires began to descend into the slipstream. The All-American shuddered violently. The drag hit them like a physical wall. The nose pitched down aggressively. and Bragg had to heave back on the yoke with every ounce of remaining strength just to keep them level. "Gear is down and locked," Engel panted. "Tail wheel, unknown." They had no idea if the small rear wheel, housed in the shattered section of the tail, would deploy, or if it even still existed. "Tell the crew to brace for impact," Bragg commanded. "Tell Sal we're bringing him home." At 200 feet, the desert ground rushed up to meet them. The heat radiating off the tarmac created thermals that bounced the crippled bomber wildly. Bragg ignored the conventional landing speeds. He brought the All-American in hot, keeping the airspeed up to ensure the tail stayed pressed against the fuselage by the wind for as long as possible. 50 feet. The engines were pulled back to an idle. The sudden silence in the cockpit was deafening. "Hold her off." "Hold her off," Bragg whispered to himself, his eyes locked on the dirt. He flared the aircraft at the absolute last microsecond. The main wheels kissed the dirt runway with a gentle chirp, sending a plume of red dust into the air. It was the softest, most perfect touchdown Bragg had ever executed in his life. But they were moving at over 100 miles an hour, and the runway was running out. "Applying brakes," Bragg shouted. He tapped the pedals gently, terrified of tipping the nose forward. As the bomber decelerated, the aerodynamic pressure that had been holding the tail in place began to vanish. The horrific weight of the severed empennage took over. With a sickening metallic screech, the tail section slumped downward. The two remaining aluminum stringers bent, but miraculously did not snap. The rear tail wheel, bent at a grotesque angle, hit the dirt and dragged, carving a deep trench into the runway. The All-American groaned, shuddered, and finally rolled to a complete stop at the very edge of the airfield. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence inside the aircraft. Then, a frantic scramble erupted. Gallagher, Zook, and Coulson tore through the waste, ignoring the severed drop, and ripped at the crushed metal of the tail gunner's door. Emergency crews from the base were already swarming the aircraft, their faces pale as they looked at the massive severed gap in the fuselage. Firemen sprayed foam on the overheated engines, while medics rushed to the rear. With a final heave, Gallagher and a ground mechanic pried the jammed door open. Sal Taormina practically fell out of the compartment, collapsing into Gallagher's arms. He was covered in sweat, grease, and hydraulic fluid, shivering uncontrollably in the desert heat. But he was alive. Without a single scratch on him, Bragg and Engel climbed down from the forward hatch. Their legs turned to jelly the moment their boots touched the solid earth. They walked slowly toward the rear of the aircraft, joining the growing crowd of ground crew and officers who were staring in absolute silence at the impossible machine. The tail of the All-American was resting precariously on the dirt, completely severed on the top and sides, connected to the main body of the plane by nothing but a few twisted pieces of floorboard and the shredded remnants of Zook and Coulson's parachute harnesses. It was a mathematical absurdity. The bomber had flown over 300 miles, survived a mountain range, and executed a perfect landing, all while effectively cut in half. Bragg walked over to Sal, placing a heavy, trembling hand on the small gunner's shoulder. Sal looked up at his pilot, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. "Thanks for the ride home, Captain," Sal whispered. Bragg didn't say a word. He just nodded, pulling the young man into a fierce embrace as the ambulance sirens wailed into the desert afternoon. The story of the All-American remains one of the most astonishing feats of airmanship and structural resilience in the history of military aviation. Photographs of the bomber, sitting on the Biskra tarmac with its fuselage sliced wide open, quickly became the stuff of legend. Aircraft engineers who later examined the damage concluded that the bomber should have disintegrated within seconds of the mid-air collision, that it survived a 300-mile journey over hostile territory, mountains, and desert thermals, defies all conventional laws of aerodynamics. First Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg's absolute refusal to abandon his trapped tail gunner, combined with the desperate ingenuity of his crew, tying the plane together with parachute webbing, elevated a deadly catastrophe into a miracle. It stands as a timeless testament to the unbreakable bond of bomber crews, proving that sometimes, Human willpower is stronger than shattered steel.